What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a simple interview, only to face a host who thinks he can tear down decades of dignity with cheap shots and lazy questions? It only took 35 seconds of Stephen Colbert's smugness for Denzel Washington to realize this wasn't going to be the respectful conversation he was promised. The late-night studio felt different that evening. The usual energy was there, the cameras were rolling, and the audience was buzzing with excitement. They had come to see Denzel Washington, a man who had commanded respect in Hollywood for over 4 decades. But what they were about to witness would become one of the most uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. Denzel walked onto the set with his characteristic calm confidence. He wore a simple navy blue suit, no flashy accessories, no desperate attempt to grab attention. He was there to talk about his latest film, to connect with fans, and to share some insights from his remarkable career. The audience erupted in applause as he made his way to the guest chair, waving politely and offering that warm smile that had charmed moviegoers for generations. Stephen Colbert bounced in his seat behind the desk, practically vibrating with what seemed like excitement but carried an edge that anyone paying close attention might have noticed. His opening monologue had been particularly sharp that night, full of political jabs and cultural commentary that felt more bitter than clever. The studio audience had laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that felt obligatory rather than genuine. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the incredible Denzel Washington," Colbert announced, his voice carrying that familiar late-night host enthusiasm that somehow managed to sound both welcoming and slightly mocking at the same time. Denzel settled into the guest chair, adjusting his jacket and looking directly at Colbert with the kind of steady gaze that had intimidated countless characters on screen. He was ready for a normal conversation, the kind he had done hundreds of times before with hosts who understood the basic rules of respect and professionalism. "Denzel, great to have you here," Colbert began, but there was something in his tone that didn't quite match the words. "I have to ask, and I know this might be uncomfortable, but don't you think it's time you admitted that your best days are behind you?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The audience fell silent, unsure if they had heard correctly. Even the camera operators seemed to pause, as if the entire production had suddenly shifted into unfamiliar territory. Denzel's expression didn't change immediately. He had dealt with difficult interviews before, with hostile journalists and provocative questions designed to create controversy rather than genuine conversation. But this felt different. This felt personal and unnecessarily cruel. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Denzel asked, his voice still calm but with an undertone that suggested Colbert had just made a serious mistake. Colbert leaned back in his chair with a smirk that suggested he was enjoying this moment far too much. "I mean, come on, when was your last really great performance? Training Day was over 20 years ago. Malcolm X was even longer. Don't you think you're just coasting now, taking roles because you're Denzel Washington rather than because you're bringing anything new to the table?" The audience was now completely silent. This wasn't the playful banter they had come to expect from late-night television. This was something else entirely, something that felt mean, spirited, and unnecessarily aggressive. Denzel placed his hands on the armrests of his chair and took a slow, measured breath. "Stephen, I came here tonight to talk about my new film and to have a respectful conversation with you and your audience. I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish with questions like that." "Oh, I'm just trying to have an honest conversation," Colbert replied, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Isn't that what good journalism is supposed to be about? Asking the tough questions instead of just lobbing softballs?" "Tough questions are one thing," Denzel responded, his voice remaining steady despite the obvious provocation. "Disrespectful questions designed to embarrass your guest are something else entirely. I've been acting for over 40 years, and I've been fortunate enough to work with some of the most talented people in this industry. I'm proud of the work I've done, and I'm proud of the work I continue to do." Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by Denzel's measured response, as if he had found a weakness to exploit. "But don't you think audiences deserve better than actors who are just going through the motions? Don't you think there's something almost insulting about taking roles when you're clearly not bringing your A-game anymore?" The question was so loaded with assumptions and disrespect that even some audience members began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was watching a host attempt to humiliate one of the most respected actors of his generation for no apparent reason other than his own ego. Denzel straightened in his chair, and for the first time since the interview began, his calm facade showed the slightest crack. "Stephen, I think you're confused about what your job is supposed to be here. Your job is to make your guests feel welcome and to create an entertaining show for your audience. You're not a prosecutor, and I'm not on trial. But shouldn't celebrities be held accountable? Colbert pressed, clearly enjoying the tension he was creating. Shouldn't we be able to call out mediocrity when we see it, even if it comes from someone as famous as you? The word mediocrity seemed to echo through the studio. It was such a deliberately insulting choice, so clearly designed to provoke a reaction, that even the production crew seemed uncomfortable. Camera operators were looking at each other with expressions that suggested they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. Denzel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working slightly as he processed not just the words, but the entire situation he found himself in. He had been in this business long enough to know when someone was trying to create drama at his expense, and he had no intention of playing along. "I think we need to stop right here," Denzel said, finally, his voice carrying authority that filled the entire studio. "This isn't a conversation. This isn't an interview. This is you trying to tear down someone who has spent decades building a career based on hard work and respect for the craft. And I'm not going to sit here and be your entertainment." Colbert's response was immediate and telling. Instead of recognizing that he had crossed a line, instead of showing even a hint of professional courtesy, he doubled down with the kind of arrogance that only comes from someone who believes their platform makes them untouchable. "Oh, come on, Denzel," Colbert said, with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if he was talking to a child having a tantrum rather than one of the most accomplished actors of his generation. "You're being way too sensitive. This is late-night television. We make jokes, we push buttons, we have fun. If you can't handle a little honest criticism, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews." The audacity of that statement hung in the air like a challenge. Here was a host who had just spent several minutes insulting his guest, now trying to frame his behavior as normal entertainment, while simultaneously suggesting that Denzel was the problem for not accepting the disrespect with a smile. Denzel's eyes narrowed slightly, and anyone who had seen his performances knew that this was the moment when his characters typically shifted from patience to action. "A little honest criticism?" he repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made everyone in the studio pay closer attention. "Stephen, there's nothing honest about what you've been doing here tonight. You've been trying to provoke me from the moment I sat down." "Maybe I have," Colbert admitted with a shrug that suggested he felt no shame about his tactics. "But isn't that more interesting than the usual boring celebrity interview where everyone pretends everything is wonderful? At least I'm being real with you." "Real?" Denzel stood up from his chair, and the simple action seemed to change the entire energy of the room. He wasn't shouting, he wasn't making dramatic gestures, but his presence suddenly filled the space in a way that made everyone else seem smaller. "You want to talk about being real? Let's be real. You brought me on this show under false pretenses. You told my people this would be a respectful conversation about my work. Instead, you've used your platform to try to embarrass me for your own entertainment." Colbert seemed momentarily thrown by Denzel's decision to stand, but he quickly recovered with the kind of nervous laughter that bullies often use when their targets refuse to stay down. "Wow, okay. I think you're really overreacting here. I mean, come on, sit back down. We're just having a conversation." "No, Stephen, we're not having a conversation," Denzel replied, his voice steady but filled with the kind of controlled anger that was somehow more intimidating than any explosion would have been. "A conversation requires two people who respect each other. What you've been doing is using your position to attack someone who came here in good faith." The audience was completely silent now, and not the comfortable silence of people enjoying a show. This was the tense, uncomfortable silence of people watching something they weren't sure they should be seeing. Some audience members were looking around nervously, as if they were trying to figure out how to escape from a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. Colbert, perhaps realizing that the situation was getting away from him, tried to regain control with the kind of fake concern that television personalities often use when they need to appear reasonable. "Look, Denzel, I think maybe you're misunderstanding what I'm trying to do here. I'm not attacking you. I'm just trying to have an engaging interview." "Engaging?" Denzel's voice rose slightly for the first time since the interview began. "You think insulting your guest is engaging? You think questioning their talent and suggesting they're washed up is good television? Let me ask you something, Stephen. When was the last time you did anything that required real courage? When was the last time you put yourself on the line for something you believed in?" The question hit Colbert like a physical blow. His confident smirk faltered, and for a moment, his carefully constructed television persona cracked just enough to show the insecurity underneath. That's not relevant to what we're talking about." "It's completely relevant," Denzel pressed, stepping closer to the desk. "You sit behind that desk every night and take shots at people who are actually out there doing the work, creating things, taking risks. You've made a career out of being clever at other people's expense. So don't talk to me about being real when your entire job is built on hiding behind jokes and sarcasm. The production crew was now visibly uncomfortable. Camera operators were looking toward the control booth, waiting for someone to make a decision about whether to keep filming or cut to commercial. The audience seemed frozen, unsure whether they should be clapping, booing, or simply leaving. Colbert's face was flushed now, and his voice carried a defensive edge that hadn't been there before. I think you're way out of line here, Denzel. This is my show, and I have the right to ask whatever questions I want. You don't get to come on here and lecture me about how to do my job. Your show? Denzel laughed, but there was no humor in it. You're right. This is your show, and you've just shown your audience exactly what kind of person you really are. You've shown them that you're willing to disrespect a guest for no reason other than your own entertainment. You've shown them that you think being a host gives you the right to be cruel. I wasn't being cruel, Colbert protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I was doing my job. If this is your job, Denzel said, gesturing around the studio, then you're terrible at it. A good host makes their guests comfortable. A good host asks questions that illuminate something meaningful. A good host treats people with basic human decency. You've done none of those things tonight. Colbert was clearly struggling now, caught between his ego and the growing realization that he had badly miscalculated. Look, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't we start over? We can talk about your new movie. Keep things light. Denzel shook his head slowly. We're not starting over, Stephen. You don't get to insult someone and then pretend it never happened when you realize you've made a mistake. That's not how respect works. That's not how dignity works. And that's certainly not how being a decent human being works. The studio had become a pressure cooker, and everyone could feel it was about to explode. Colbert, now visibly sweating under the studio lights, made one final desperate attempt to salvage his crumbling authority. What came out of his mouth next would be the moment that ended any chance of redemption. You know what, Denzel? Colbert said, his voice taking on a nasty edge that revealed his true character. Maybe the problem isn't me asking tough questions. Maybe the problem is that you can't handle the fact that you're not as important as you used to be. Maybe the problem is that you're just another aging actor who can't accept that Hollywood has moved on. The words hit the studio like a bomb going off. The audience gasped collectively, and several people could be heard muttering in disbelief. Even the camera operators stopped what they were doing, staring at their host with expressions of shock and disgust. Denzel went completely still. For a moment, he simply stared at Colbert with the kind of intensity that had made him one of the most powerful screen presences of his generation. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely devastating. Stephen, in 40 years of doing interviews, I have never been treated with such complete disrespect by someone who calls himself a professional. You just revealed everything anyone needs to know about who you really are. You're not a host. You're not a comedian. You're not even a decent person. You're a bully who thinks his platform gives him the right to tear down people who are better than him. Colbert's face went pale, then flushed red. Now wait just a minute. You can't talk to me like that on my own show. I can talk to you however I want, Denzel replied, his voice rising for the first time to a level that commanded absolute attention from everyone in the building. Because unlike you, I've earned the right to speak with authority. I've spent decades building something meaningful. I've used my platform to lift people up, not tear them down. I've treated people with respect even when they didn't deserve it. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air like a judgment, and Colbert had no answer. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. He had been completely exposed, stripped of his clever remarks and sardonic wit, revealed as nothing more than a small, petty man who had vastly overestimated his own importance. That's what I thought, Denzel continued, now speaking directly to the audience as much as to Colbert. This man brought me here tonight under false pretenses. He promised a respectful conversation and instead tried to use me as a target for his own insecurities. He thought he could diminish me to make himself feel bigger. But you can't diminish someone by being small. You only diminish yourself. A few audience members began to clap, slowly at first, then building to sustained applause. They were applauding not just Denzel's words, but his refusal to accept disrespect, his dignity in the face of cruelty, his willingness to stand up for himself when someone in power tried to abuse that power. Colbert looked around desperately, realizing that he had lost not just the interview, but his entire audience. "Security!" he called out, his voice cracking with panic. "I think we need security in here." Security? Denzel laughed, and this time there was genuine amusement in his voice. Stephen, I'm not threatening you. I'm not being violent. I'm simply refusing to accept your disrespect. If that makes you feel like you need security, then maybe you should think about why treating people decently feels so foreign to you. You're disrupting my show, Colbert shouted, his composure completely gone now. This is my studio, my audience, my show. And you've just shown them exactly what your show really is, Denzel replied calmly. You've shown them that it's a place where guests can be humiliated for entertainment. You've shown them that you think being a host means you can treat people however you want. You've shown them who you really are when the cameras are rolling, and you think you have all the power. By now, more audience members were standing and applauding. Some were even shouting their support for Denzel, their voices carrying over the chaos that had engulfed the studio. The production crew was in complete disarray, with some filming, others trying to figure out what to do, and everyone looking around for someone to make a decision about how to handle this unprecedented situation. Colbert made one final, desperate attempt to regain control. Ladies and gentlemen, I think our guest needs to calm down and remember where he is. I know exactly where I am, Denzel said, his voice cutting through the noise like a sword. I'm in a place where a small man thought he could use his position to make himself feel important by tearing down someone else. I'm in a place where basic human decency apparently doesn't exist. I'm in a place where I was invited as a guest and treated like an enemy. He turned toward the audience, and his voice filled the entire studio with an authority that no amount of clever writing or production value could match. I came here tonight to talk about my work and to connect with all of you. Instead, I found myself having to defend my dignity against someone who seems to think that being a host gives him the right to be cruel. I won't do it. I won't sit here and pretend that this is acceptable behavior. The applause was thunderous now, with the majority of the audience on their feet. Some were even chanting Denzel's name, turning what was supposed to be Colbert's show into something entirely different. I'm leaving, Denzel announced, and somehow those two simple words carried more power than anything else that had been said all evening. Not because I'm running away, but because I refuse to give this kind of behavior my blessing by staying and pretending it's entertainment. He began walking toward the exit, his back straight, his dignity intact. Every step a rejection of everything Colbert had tried to do to him. The audience erupted in even louder applause, many of them standing on their chairs now, showing their support for a man who had refused to be diminished. Wait, you can't just leave, Colbert called after him, his voice desperate and pathetic. We're not done here. Denzel stopped at the edge of the set and turned back one final time. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that the studio had to go completely silent to hear him, but strong enough to ensure that every word would be remembered. Stephen, we were done the moment you decided to treat a guest with disrespect. We were done the moment you chose cruelty over conversation. We were done the moment you revealed that you care more about your own ego than about the people who trust you with their time and their stories. I hope your audience remembers this moment, because this is who you really are when you think no one important is watching. And with that, Denzel Washington walked out of the studio, leaving behind a host whose arrogance had just cost him everything, an audience that had witnessed something they would never forget, and a moment that would define what happens when dignity meets disrespect and refuses to back down.